we've got the national championship coming up. So joining me today, we've got Lulu Kesin. She's of the Greenville News, covers South Carolina women's basketball. She's here to help us break it down. So Lulu, thanks so much for hopping on.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I know obviously when we look at this matchup, there's going to be a lot of talk about what happened when these two teams matched up in February, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I figure let's start by just kind of talking about things a little bit more recently here with this South Carolina team. Just kind of give me your overall thoughts on how this team has performed in the tournament, because I know that they've been pushed for sure, in several of these rounds here in the NCAA tournament. So just kind of give me your overall thoughts on where you think this team stands right now.
I think South Carolina, in a way, has still yet to play its best basketball in the tournament. And I know that's kind of a scary thought if you're a South Carolina fan, just knowing that there's only one game left to do that. But I definitely think the win against Texas last night was sort of South Carolina basketball again. I think, particularly on offense, the Gamecocks have struggled. I would say that's my biggest takeaway from the early rounds and then the Elite Eight and the Sweet 16 is just the offense didn't have the flow that it normally does. So I think that it was a healthy mix of, they're playing good teams. Maryland was a really good team. Duke was a number two seed. They weren't playing against 16 seeds every night, but I think they were probably expecting to play a little bit better on offense than they did and probably produced below their standard in that regard.
Yeah, what do you think teams have done that has kind of pushed this South Carolina team a little bit more than maybe we've seen in past tournaments?
Well, I think an interesting factor is that in the last couple years, they've had, I would say, more than one star, but
Mhm.
one main scorer. It was 6'7" Camila Cardoso last year, and then they had Aaliyah Boston. There were other, teams were able to really draw focus to one player, and a lot of kind of success that South Carolina has had was when teams don't go at just one player, they're able to get flow and production from everyone. Then come the tournament, it felt like teams sort of started to figure out Joyce Edwards, who wasn't putting up 20 per night. I think she's averaging 13, but was still the leading scorer. And it wasn't that, oh, Joyce doesn't score, no one else can. Chloe Kitts, Sanaya Fagan stepped up in those regards. But I think that overall, when Joyce was getting double teamed and they were just lacking, that inside out offense that they're so good at, I think defenses really thrived off of that and sort of stopping the second and third option for South Carolina, especially when it seemed like they were almost stopping those options for themselves at the same time.
What would you say have kind of been some of the keys for South Carolina to be able to pull out some of these wins, especially in these tight situations? You can kind of looking a little bit towards those fourth quarters, especially against Maryland and Duke.
Yeah, well, something that Dawn says on offense is like, oh, you have to scout for everyone. But I think on defense, she doesn't really have a weak spot, which is huge, especially against Texas. When you're guarding Madison Booker, you need to be able to also defend her kick out passes. Bree Hall is great defending one-on-one, but she needs help when when Booker's looking to dish. And so I think South Carolina's kind of the name of their game has been defense and running out in transition as a result. They always say like defense turns into offense. And so when they're getting the good stops and when all five are disciplined and matching their assignment, they're able to outrun teams just knowing that they have the depth and athleticism to do so. I mean, they basically have another starting five sitting on the bench. So you're able to play kind of, I don't want to say more free, but you're just able to capitalize knowing like, okay, it won't be huge if I need to sit out for 2 minutes and someone off the bench comes in because honestly, the people coming off the bench are the ones scoring the most right now. So outrunning teams in transition and just turning disciplined defense into offense has kind of just been their golden, spot or area.
I think one thing that impressed me about this team, especially last night, for a team that has been pushed a bit more in the tournament, they get down early to Texas, and it didn't seem like that they panicked much. It seemed like they really just buckled down and then obviously just wore Texas down. What was kind of your thoughts when they got down in that hole early as they were trying to make their way back in the game?
Yeah, I wasn't I honestly wasn't too surprised only because South Carolina, like Tahina Pow joked yesterday, like we shouldn't be used to knowing how to come back from slow starts, but we are. And like we've seen a lot of that from South Carolina this year. The thing that I was explaining not long ago, like even when they played a Mississippi State, a team that was just on paper worse, they would exhaust all their energy, their opponent would, in the first
Mhm.
5 minutes. Like, oh, we got to set the tone, we got to, come out firing. But the only two teams that have been able to come out firing and match that have been UCLA and UConn. Everybody else has tried so hard to get South Carolina in those first 5 minutes. And even the Texas game when South Carolina lost, it was back and forth. So last night I was like kind of like, oh, here we go again. But at the same time, I was like, this game is going to run away if South Carolina doesn't cut it within 3 or 4, just because so much of it's sort of like someone said to me, like, trust what you see. Like,
Mhm.
as much as these may be bad habits, South Carolina has been able to be down from like 4 or 5 and kind of change the tone of the game in the other quarters. And that was sort of what played out.
Yeah. All right, so let's dive in and look back a little bit at the matchup we saw in February. I think even me as someone who's big of a fan as you can get, I'm not sure I expected the performance they had when they came down to South Carolina. What surprised you the most, kind of looking back now at that matchup from February?
Yeah, I think that when South Carolina lost to UCLA, I expected that 100%. Based on the way they started the season, I was almost like they kind of need a loss. They had been starting slow on defense, kind of had no ball movement on offense, and I was like, this is going to come back to bite them at some point. It's better that it happens early. And then they won 17 straight games. So what surprised me the most about the UConn loss was that it was right after the Texas loss. And South Carolina has been so good at, recovering after
Mhm.
a bad game. And so when UConn just embarrassed them in every way. And that was, I think, the biggest part was that they knew UConn had, the three-headed monster of Paige, Fudd, and Sarah.
Yeah.
But it was like every other element of the game, UConn had the advantage, whether that was rebounding, whether that was loose balls, forcing turnovers, steals, and South Carolina has been able to, shut down star players. So when they were just failing to do that, also failing to just do every little thing right, that's, I think, the most surprising part, which I know is a general answer, but
Yeah.
it just felt like the effort. And, as Chloe Kit said, like they just like outworked us in every way. They exhausted us. They were better. They had more effort. And I think that it was just a matter of South Carolina had no way of showing South Carolina basketball that day.
Yeah. Clearly, they were able to hold Page down to some extent in that game. You look back at the box score, three of 12 from the field to only 12 points. I think most nights, if you can probably hold Page to numbers like that, you're probably gonna win. How different do you see this matchup being in terms of, maybe the focus isn't quite as much on kind of trying to stop Page, but putting some focus on some of these other players as well.
Yeah, and I will say I didn't watch. I was writing during the UConn UCLA game last night, but from what I've read and understood, it sort of felt like UCLA put so much energy into stopping Page, and everyone else thrived off of that. And I think that South Carolina, whether they really intended to or not, is going to be a lot more disciplined all over UConn, knowing that they have so many weapons. And so with Dawn Staley, she's a coach who has seen so many different versions of Paige at this point, but she hasn't seen so many different versions of Sarah. So I think that it's almost to her advantage that she's able to look at Sarah and be like, she's incredibly dominant. Like we have to do this, and that because, as Dawn said with Texas, like they know each other so well, you have to know and go to your second, third, fourth option. You just have to play basketball. And so I think South Carolina knows that UConn isn't going to go away if one or even two shooters aren't performing well. And I think that will be a motivational factor to be disciplined, like I said, on defense everywhere, because on any given night with UConn, it could be way more than just Paige.
Yeah. As you look to this rematch tomorrow afternoon, what are you kind of most looking forward to as you're kind of thinking about this game in advance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope it's a great game. I love close basketball games. They're incredibly stressful to cover, but I do like that competitive environment. It would be difficult, I think, for South Carolina to swallow if the controllable factors were, if they suffered.
Mhm.
They've said like we're going to play physical, we can't handle how the refs call the game. We'll adapt. We're obviously not going to get ourselves in foul trouble on purpose, but if the effort and their chemistry suffers, I think that will be a true sign of how the game is going to go. UConn can take you out of rhythm. UConn, as Raven Johnson said, they thrive off of bad basketball, and or South Carolina can prevent that if they play together and play with a lot of heart and effort. And so that's sort of both teams, they're so different. But at the same time, I think that they're both incredibly disciplined and well coached. And so I do think heart and passion and just the controllable factors are going to be the difference in the game.
Yeah, I'm just curious from maybe from both sides, having seen this matchup once already, what do you think UConn would have to do to replicate what happened back in February? And then if South Carolina wants to prevent that from happening, what do you think's kind of their biggest focal point heading into the game?
Yeah, well, transition threes killed South Carolina last time. And Beck, Paige only had 12 points, but she dished 10 really great
Yeah.
assists. She was just instrumental. So I think making sure that Paige isn't able to just take complete control of the offense. It's not just her scoring, but it's making sure that you're knowing where her second, third, and fourth pass may go. I think just more ball movement from South Carolina. I think UConn, they've been so dominant because they've just been so connected. It's really, really hard to take UConn out of rhythm. I think like what is most impressive is they'll come out of a timeout after, I think it was the USC game, like USC cut it to 10, and they came out of a timeout and Caitlin Chen had the and
Right.
one to cut it back to to make it back to 13. Like they're so intelligent. UConn is their IQ is so high, their motor, their effort, that's all there. They just kind of have to play their game and know that South Carolina is going to attempt to take them out of rhythm. And I
Mhm.
think if UConn is unfazed by everything South Carolina tries, they have all the momentum to win. But I do think South Carolina has the adaptability and the effort and the skill to take them out of rhythm.
Yeah. I'll wrap with this one for you. I think if I counted right, I think it's tw been 12 in a row for South Carolina since they lost to UConn in February. How different of a team is this South Carolina team going to look when they step out on court against UConn than they did in that first matchup?
I think completely different. And I do think that South Carolina has had like peaks and valleys. It's been up and it's been down. I think that they played some of their best basketball for like a 5 game stretch in January. And then I think they almost exhausted themselves. Not making excuses for the loss in Austin or the loss to UConn, but I think that they had that really hot streak to close January and then felt a little bit lost, mentally fatigued. And I think that it took them a little bit to get there. And they chipped away at it throughout the early stages of the tournament. But I do think that even the team that South Carolina was in the Elite Eight versus Final Four is so different. And I imagine that that's going to just continue up come
Mhm.
Sunday.
Awesome. Well, Lulu, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to come on and help preview this game in advance of the big championship on Sunday. So thanks so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.